What's up, STS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, the podcast that promises to bring you the very best guests in true crime, and they keep on coming. You've got two new faces today. A big possible development in the case of missing Colorado mom, Suzanne Morphew. We have not discussed this case on STS, but it is a very big case nationally, garnering a lot of attention. Just this past week, a prosecutor working on the case announced in open court that investigators suspect they know the location of her body, which I guess is a mixed bag of news. That would imply, obviously, she's no longer with us, but maybe they're moving ahead in the investigation. The question, obviously, remains, where is she and who is responsible? Best guests here tonight, and they are good ones. You've got Ira Gruber. She's an expert on criminal law and procedure, violence against women, and critical theory. Before joining the USC Gould School of Law faculty, which she just did about 5 days ago, she taught at the University of Colorado Law School, where she was the Ira C. Rothgerber Professor of Constitutional Law and Criminal Justice, and she was just featured on the 48-hour show about the Suzanne Morphew case. A good episode if you have not seen it. The man who looks like he's in a law office, that is Jeremy Lowe. He is a former Colorado State public defender turned Colorado Springs criminal defense attorney. He has aggressively represented thousands of clients in Colorado in all aspects of criminal defense, domestic violence, and personal injury. And prior to his legal practice, this caught my attention as a former Fox News guy in D.C. Jeremy worked in politics in D.C., where he was able to work for not one, but two United States presidents. We'll ask him about that shortly. And then Dr. J.P. Garrison, the man with possibly the best voice on STS. He earned a PsyD in clinical psychology from the Georgia School of Professional Psychology and has been cited for his expertise in psychology in numerous media outlets, including Business Insider, Forbes, Vice, Huffington Post, Yahoo News, Fatherly, and of course now STS. He's also, I love this, studied the language and culture of South Korea for over a decade and has his own YouTube channel and big fan base, and it's called Dr. G Explained. So thank you to all of you. Quick reminder, follow us on Facebook, Insta, Twitter. We're a podcast STS. You can also listen to us anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can support us on Patreon, become a YouTube member, hit that like button, as my now 9-year-old daughter coming home from sleepaway camp tomorrow says. It gets the algorithm chugging. And the merch store's open, and I am working on getting a hat. So, Jeremy, who are the two presidents? Everyone wants to know before we get started.
President Clinton and President Obama. So I'm a Democrat. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. President Clinton and one with zero scandal, one with a never-ending cascade of scandals. But,
never-ending. But that's why we love him, right?
Yeah, but we won't go into that right now. But we will do a quick recap. So for those of you who do not know, and this is a very complicated case with a million different tentacles, but Suzanne Morphew, she goes missing on Mother's Day 2020 in the early morning of May 10th. Barry, her husband, left his home just outside of Salida. Am I saying that to us? Is that pronounced correctly? Salida, yes, right?
It's
right?
Salida.
There you go. So just outside of Salida, Colorado. And he went to a job site 150 miles away in Broomfield, Colorado. After he left the house, as kids do on Mother's Day, the two daughters who were out of town on a camping trip started texting their mom, Happy Mother's Day, and got no response. Mallory, one of the daughters, she informs her father that they're unable to reach Suzanne. Barry says he finally reaches a neighbor, and he asks Suzanne if the mountain bike is at their home. I'm going to stop it right there, Aya. As you understand it, is this kind of how the day started to play out back on that fateful Mother's Day of 2020?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I probably should mention that Barry did call his daughters fairly early on in the morning to say, have you heard from mom? So it wasn't complete radio silence from him. But it was sort of throughout the day that the daughters and Barry are noticing that this is Mother's Day, and usually Suzanne answers her phone, and she didn't. And that's sort of when he asked the neighbor to go check on her, and specifically to see if her bike is there.
Yeah. And Jeremy, I'm going to have you bounce in here.
Sure.
What caught my attention and, reading up on the case, and I did watch the 48 hours, is he calls the neighbor and he doesn't necessarily say, is my wife there, but he very specifically asks about this mountain bike, which is found a short time later, sort of on the side of a cliff. You're a defense attorney and you were a prosecutor. Is that interesting to you in any way, that maybe he's shaping a narrative early on?
Yes, and it's probably the worst thing that he could be doing is saying, have you seen the bike? And the other interesting thing is he's not really in the area at this time. He's gone up to the Denver metro area for a job that was supposed to start essentially the next day, is what the allegations are. So have you seen my wife's bike? And he's left the area for a project that starts 24 hours later. It doesn't make a lot of sense that he would leave so early. But, there are a lot of things in this case that don't make sense, and I'm sure we'll get into them. And there are so many errors on by an inept prosecution that it is shocking. This case, and I'm sure you'll get into it, has taken so many twists and turns.
Yeah.
And it just keeps on getting worse for everybody involved.
Yeah, and I love it because Jeremy is building up the suspense, but there are more than a few aha moments or oh my God, or as I guess we would say in Surviving the Survivor, some oy vey moments. And we will get into all those. Dr. G, I'm going to have you explain this. So Melinda Mormon, the sister of Suzanne Morphew, she received a text from Suzanne 2 days before she went missing. And according to Melinda, this text message was, quote unquote, boiling over with anger toward Barry. And it read in part, and this is a direct quote, he's also been abusive emotionally and physically. I feel more angry now, anger at what I've allowed. You're the psychologist. What does that tell you about the rocky state of their relationship?
Well, it tells us a lot. I mean, and I'm sure we'll get into more of it. There's also a lot of history there as far as things that were caught on this recording pin and some other stuff. But basically, it shows that if that's in fact true, if he was physically and emotionally abusive, that shows a level of someone who is able to perpetrate some pretty heinous acts that, as far as I know, haven't been talked about otherwise. I don't think was ever arrested for domestic violence or anything like that. So it does show that the capacity to engage in that shows somebody that could potentially do something worse. So that's always concerning when that background is there.
And I meant to mention off the top, so now retired FBI agent Johnny Grusing, he's worked this case and he's become a friend of the show. If you guys didn't see it, I did Surviving My Biggest Case with him, and it was about serial killer Scott Kimball. But I did reach out to Johnny, and he's got a dry sense of humor. No commented me because of what I'm about to talk about next. But just wrapping up sort of the day of, Barry, according to reports, he doesn't head home immediately. He drops off a shovel and some other tools. Keep in mind, though, he was a landscaper, but still, anytime you hear missing woman and shovel, those aren't the best coupling of words in a sentence that you want to hear. But so he drops off his tools for his coworkers, where he'd booked rooms for them, again in Broomfield, 150 miles away or so. And then he begins driving home. So he didn't head home immediately that day. But Aya, back to you. Now kind of fast forwarding to the latest on this case, Deputy District Attorney Mark Herbert said in open court that investigators now suspect they know the location of Suzanne's body. I mean, what does that say to you as an attorney and someone who's interested in this case, has been looking at it for a long time?
Well, I don't know how much you want me to spoiler alert what you're about to get into.
You can go for it, because we're gonna kind of circle around, so it's totally your call.
So there are some pieces of physical evidence that, both the police in sort of focusing almost relentlessly on Barry Morphew as a suspect to their own detriment, because I think it's going to be extremely difficult to resurrect this case. And they're being sued for $15 million. So, I mean, that sort of, I'm not the psychologist, but that sort of cognitive bias, that certainty error sort of like had them relentlessly focused. Well, they had to deal with certain pieces of evidence that, were tricky for them. And one of the pieces of evidence was that there was basically no DNA, blood evidence, or any sort of evidence that physically linked Barry to a murder, right? So then they had to come up with, some theories of how he nonetheless committed a murder. And one of them we're going to get into was that he used a tranquilizer, right? And that wouldn't leave any blood. One of the things that came to light that was so damning, and I'm sure we're going to get into it later, was the very early dismissing of what I think was an incredibly credible kidnapping theory, especially given the DNA evidence, right? And so I think that was something that, still to this day is going on. Now, that's not completely inconsistent with there being a body nearby, right? They could still kidnap and then the body could be nearby. But I think it would go a long way to dispelling what I think from the beginning was a credible theory, which is that somebody nabbed her, right? Either while she was on her bike or more likely from her car. And so if they can find the body, it's nearby, they can find some evidence linking Barry to the body or reconstruct, that scene, and it's consistent with some of the car and cell phone pinging evidence, that's going to be really big, because I think the big problematic thing for them was that there's this completely plausible alternate theory of how she goes missing.
Yeah, and what I was alluding to, which we'll get to again, a very windy road this case is, but some male DNA is found, and we don't have the identity of who it belongs to, but they do know that it's connected to some prior sexual assaults.
Well, actually, they do know.
Oh, they do.
And that person lawyered up, but they had to do some phone calls to Arizona to find out who that person was. But we can get into that.
Okay. Can I just kind of chime in about the body issue?
Yeah, hop right in. Well, Jeremy, give me 1 sec. I just want to. So I was saying, once if they can locate this body, then they can possibly get some DNA evidence off of it. But this assistant district attorney says, and this is a quote here, and I'll have you react, Jeremy. She's in a, quote, very difficult spot. And he goes on to say, we actually have more than just a feeling, and the sheriff's office is continuing to look for Mrs. Morphew's body. So with that, go ahead, Jeremy.
Okay, so this is not new information. They said this a year ago, and they said that they were waiting for the snow to melt before they could get to the body. Now, I found it ironic that they were saying literally last week that they know where the body is and they're having a hard time getting to it. We literally were able to get bodies from the Titanic at the same time that this district attorney's office is saying that we know where the body is and we're having a hard time getting to it. And it comes at a really interesting time. So Barry Morphew's attorney, Ira C, filed a motion. And the motion was for the case to be dismissed with prejudice. So where are we at right now, right? Where we're at right now is the prosecution, who probably should never have filed the case. And I can give a little background on that if you'd like. The prosecutor.
Go ahead, but I'd like to know why you think they so royally screwed this up and why they're so inept. I'm sure you have more than a couple of reasons, but continue on.
Yes. So the prosecution filed the case. The case was eventually dismissed by the court and by the prosecutor without prejudice. So, as I have mentioned, there's now this $15 million lawsuit. So what comes with a $15 million lawsuit? where you're suing 100 different people to get this $15 million. Well, when you sue somebody, right, like Barry Morphew's doing, or 100 people, each one of those people gets to do a deposition, right? They get to defend that lawsuit and themselves individually. So Iris Eton is now asking for the case to be dismissed with prejudice. And for your listeners, what's the difference between dismissed with prejudice and dismissed without prejudice? If a case like the Morphew case, as it currently stands, is dismissed without prejudice, that means at some point down the road, the prosecution could refile the case. If a case is dismissed with prejudice, then the prosecution can never refile the case. Jeopardy has attached. And if they were essentially to discover new evidence, the case has been dismissed with prejudice and Mr. Morphew could never be charged. So this prosecutor is saying we think we know where the body is, or we know where the body is, when Iris Eton is on the other side saying we want this case dismissed with prejudice. And so there's just so many angles, so many pieces of this chess match going on. And I say chess match very loosely because what's happening here is Iris Eton and Barry Morphew's attorneys are playing chess, and this prosecution office is playing checkers. And it's absolutely crazy that they're bringing up now that they might know where the body is, when they brought it up a year ago and said they were waiting for the snow to melt. And, we have some of the best outdoorsmen in the world located here in Colorado. If they know where our body is, they can get to that body.
That's really interesting. And I was just going to come to Dr. G, but Dr. G, hang on for 1 sec. This question's waiting for you. Aya, we are covering, we just did a show on it the other night. Corey Richins, she is a Utah mom accused of poisoning her husband, Eric Richins, and she's sitting in jail right now in Park City, Utah. But she filed a civil suit, and the lawyers were saying that was a horrendous mistake who we had on the show, because as to what Jeremy was just saying, she can now be deposed, and everything that she's deposed about can be used in a criminal case against her. Is there any similarity here? Is Barry Morphew, I mean, Jeremy's talking about playing chess versus checkers, but is he walking into a trap potentially?
Normally, I would say so this is kind of going on to what Jeremy said about dismiss with prejudice. Until your criminal case is dead and buried, do not make any statements. They're not going to help you. They're not going to be good for you, especially statements under oath. Shut up, right? Like that is like the rule of thumb. It's the rule of shutting up. In this particular case, Barry has already made 40-something uncounseled statements to everybody who would listen, just kind of like spouting off theories. And they've been proven to be key pieces of why, there was an arrest warrant, there was an arrest affidavit, and why the public now comes to suspect him of this monstrous offense. With the civil suit, he'll have his attorneys, he'll be in a completely different position. So I totally hear what you're saying, that you never, as a defense attorney, want a client making statements, much less than statements under oath before a criminal trial. In this case, I don't know, maybe Jeremy would know better, but I don't know the probability of success of this civil rights case. I'd say probably it's pretty low. But I'm not sure how much the statements are going to hurt, just given what's out there.
Jeremy, who's he suing? And to Aya's point, will he get that $50 million in a settlement, do you think, or a verdict?
So he's suing essentially every prosecutor, every deputy, everybody with governmental immunity that could potentially have touched the case. they're suing them. And so here's the problem. As a defense attorney, it's not the one statement that buries your client. It's the first statement. And then there's a contradiction with the second statement, and then the third statement, and then the fourth statement. And what happens is when you're presenting a case to a jury, the jury is really looking at credibility and truthfulness. And so when somebody is giving a deposition, they may not remember certain facts that they said to a law enforcement officer 2 years ago, even if they're true. Your memory changes. How you perceive a story changes. Components are left out or they're added. And so the prosecution is going to have enough contradictions. And hopefully Dr. G can also kind of talk about this a little bit more, but you're going to have different versions of events, even if you saw the event and you remember it clearly. And those little contradictions are going to be what shows to a jury that you may not be telling the truth, even if you are, right? Or your story doesn't make sense, even when it does. And so,
yeah. Can I quickly add something to that after you're done?
Yeah, depositions and statements are the worst thing that a client can ever do. And they want to prosecute him. Everybody wants this man prosecuted, whether he's guilty or innocent. They have, jumped to conclusions, and they need to build a case around it. And anytime he tells a story to the police and then tells a story to some civil lawyer, which can be used against him, it doesn't, just because your case is dismissed doesn't mean that it's gone. And so they can order transcripts from every one of these depositions. It's the biggest mistake. And I do think he's actually opening himself up to prosecution. And that's why they want it dismissed with prejudice.
Let me just say a couple of things on that in Barry's defense. And I'm not here to defend Barry, and Dr. G, I think you could attest to this. Most people cannot imagine that somebody who says something either wild during an interrogation or inculpatory, right? Or even a confession could be innocent. When people see police interrogations, they always go in with a mindset of guilt. So it's always consistent with guilt. And I don't know how much we're going to get into the substance of Barry's 40 statements, but for example, the chipmunks statement that became, a big thing. So basically what the police had said was, given his cell phone records, when he got home, he was running around the house and he was chasing Suzanne around the house with this dart gun to tranquilize her and, kill her eventually. Yeah. And they confronted him with it. Now, it turns out that cell phone information was completely bogus. He would have to be going 50 miles an hour through walls, to meet that. But of course, he spells out, well, maybe it was some chipmunks, right? Same thing with a very low valuable data point from his car that the forensic people said, this GPS point that's somewhat near the helmet is very low value, but use it in the interrogation, right? To really press him to confess. So they use it and he's like, okay, well, sometimes I follow these elk, right? And so when we hear things like that, we're like, chipmunks, elk, this guy's guilty, right? But what we have to understand is the tactics of the police to sort of confront him with a bunch of physical evidence that it turns out is not good at all. And I think, this may be why he's like, I want to sue everybody. I mean, the types of physical evidence that were either mischaracterized or suppressed, like this DNA evidence of a sexual offender, I mean, that is some serious stuff. So I totally agree. It's never good for you to make any statements. If you think they're exculpatory, they'll catch you in an inconsistency. But I also want to make clear that the reason why confessions or statements are such good evidence, right, like eyewitness identification, is that juries believe them in a way that it doesn't always match up with the evidence on who's telling the truth.
Very interesting points. And I could do 9 hours on this tonight, but it wouldn't be fair to the guests. So we'll keep it to the normal STS time. But Dr. G, I know I'm going to get yelled at. How come you're not letting Dr. G talk? So now I'm going to let Dr. G talk. And there's a question for you right here. Does Barry appear, by the way, real quickly, I'm like the dopey guy. I'm not the lawyer. I'm not the psychologist. 10,000%, I would say this guy is guilty if it were not for that DNA that was found that's linked to this guy that committed sexual assaults, which we're going to get into. Obviously, if you're the defense and this ever went to trial, you're going to try to muddy the waters as much as possible with that. But Dr. G, does Barry appear like a man who truly is innocent, or does he appear to only want his name cleared in order to cover his involvement and take suspicion off of him? Just, you can obviously answer the question. I'm curious just your take and what you've read about him, the type of person that you believe him to be.
So rather than speaking to whether or not he's guilty or innocent, I can characterize some of the behavior I've seen from him. So, for example, the body cam footage when they found the bike, I don't know how many people have watched that, but he doesn't seem particularly distraught. Does that mean that he killed his wife? Not necessarily. Maybe he just didn't care that she was missing or that she had had a bike accident, but he didn't seem. I work with a lot of people in a lot of distress. To me, his behavior during that was the first thing that made me say that he seems a little bit odd in this situation. Once again, that doesn't imply necessarily that he committed this murder, but it does imply that his emotions didn't match up with somebody who was upset or distressed that his wife was missing. In terms of the more recent interviews that I've seen with him, because I've just seen some clips of him talking with his daughters, there's nothing that he says in those that I found particularly, for lack of a better term, suspicious. There's nothing that makes him appear to be lying specifically. I mean, he's pretty straightforward. So there's nothing specifically about his behavior during the more recent stuff that has me saying, okay, that's something that we really need to look at in particular.
Dr. G, one of the things that strikes me about this case, the Corey Richards case, so many of these cases, how is it that reality is just really stranger than fiction? I mean, if I put all these things that we're going to go through right now about chipmunks and dart guns and, potential sexual how is it that reality is so much more absurd in a way?
If you heard the things that I hear on a daily basis, you don't even know. It's really.
I heard some of them because both my dad was a psychiatrist and my mom was a therapist. I heard some of them, but
yeah. So there's no shortage of how strange the world really is, and I think that now, particularly with social media and the way that we can talk about things like we are now, is that we're able to look at so many different aspects of how strange all of this is. But yeah, it's incredibly peculiar. And my one impression that I have of Barry Morphew is that he does seem, and I don't mean this in like a diagnostic way, but he seems a little impulsive. He seems like somebody. So the idea that he would tell the story or come up with, well, maybe it was chipmunks that I was trying to shoot, or I think that's what he said, something to that effect. It's not entirely shocking with the way that he's acted and other interviews. So
Tali is checking us out from Israel. She's a criminology student in Israel. Welcome to Tali. Lorna McKenzie right here, Jeremy. The prosecution really messed up the case. Speaking of that, the deputy district attorney came out, said there was no timetable for bringing a murder case to trial. And this is a direct quote: that could be a long time. It could be quick. It could be long. It depends on a lot of our investigation. But Jeremy, to you, can you sort of pinpoint the 2 or 3 things that this prosecution, according to you, really screwed up and how they dropped the ball so badly?
Yeah. So first and foremost, we have to go back to the beginning. When Suzanne Morphew and Barry Morphew and this case came about, there was a different, quote unquote, elected district attorney down in that jurisdiction. It was a woman by the name of Caitlin Turner. Caitlin Turner and her deputy district attorney, Ashley McHugh, had the case. They had decided not at that point to bring charges. Caitlin was a Democrat appointed by Jared Polis to take over a seat that had been left by the district attorney who left midterm. Fremont County, Salida, the 11th Judicial District in Colorado, very conservative. Okay. Democrat is appointed by the governor, and she runs when it's time to run for election, and she loses to the elected who won the case and took over the prosecution. And one of the things that the now elected ran on was charging Barry Morphew. And so everybody's essentially saying, we don't have enough evidence. The FBI, Colorado Bureau of Investigation, Fremont County, Garfield County, all the law enforcement agencies are saying, we don't have enough evidence, but we have this new prosecutor who in my opinion, has really no business taking this case. I think her last prosecutorial job was a municipal city attorney in a little town called Pueblo. But she runs for election on the idea that she's going to prosecute Barry Morphew when everybody in law enforcement is saying, whoa, hold up, don't do it, right? Because there's not enough. But she decides to do it. And we have FBI agents and CBI agents who've been accused of essentially not being forthcoming with statements, not telling the truth on affidavits. We have not disclosing evidence. There were sanctions because the prosecution's office was not turning over evidence that had to be turned over, right? We have a rule in criminal procedure called Rule 16, which requires in federal cases and in state cases for the prosecution to turn over evidence, and they weren't doing it. We have a missing body, right? We have the DNA of the alleged sex offender that they didn't initially turn over to the defense. It's one thing after another that the prosecution is in way over their head. They don't know what they're doing. And as a result, they literally dismiss the case. I don't think we can really fathom what it takes for a prosecution to dismiss a first-degree murder case. I mean, there are times when prosecutors aren't certain whether or not somebody did it or not, and they'll leave it up to the jury to determine that beyond a reasonable doubt, and they'll lose, right, if the evidence isn't there. This case has been screwed up so badly that the prosecution had to dismiss it, and they dismissed it on the eve, essentially, of the Judge Lama, saying that he may suppress all the evidence in the case because the prosecution had bungled the evidence so poorly. Interestingly enough, the judge who took over for Judge Lama, who just retired, is Caitlin Turner, the prosecutor who said she wasn't going to charge the case.
To that point, Barry Morphew's and the case was essentially dropped 9 days before he was supposed to go to trial for murder. His defense team had been pressing Judge Lama to impose severe sanctions on the prosecution for failing to turn over, as I alluded to earlier, this potentially exculpatory evidence ahead of trial. And he did impose these sanctions. He barred 11 of the state's 16 endorsed expert witnesses, experts in DNA, vehicle data, cell phone data analysts. And he did this as punishment for violating discovery rules. In all, the court excluded 14 of the prosecution's expert witnesses. Aya, how common or uncommon is that? Sounds like it's not something that happens every day. And it sounds like, as they say in tennis, like an unforced error. Like they just weren't handing over the discovery the way they should have been.
I think, if I'm to look back on, I've read just thousands of pages on this case. how that ball got rolling was, I think there was an enormous amount of pressure on the police, the local police in Salida, right, the sheriff's department, to make an arrest. And in that initial arrest affidavit, they just really, if you've ever seen arrest affidavits for the FBI and then read this one, it's just not, doesn't look very professional. It's got a lot of sort of wild theories and filling in the blanks and extra things about Morphew. And I think that, once that happened and you have this arrest affidavit that paints Barry Morphew as this monster who hunted his wife, and then there were press releases, there's this pressure to go forward with this case, and they weren't ready. They needed to get all that DNA tested. They needed to really in earnest look for a body. They needed to have more fruitful interviews with Suzanne's lover, not as even as a suspect, but because he was an essential witness who could have filled in so many blanks of that day, and they just let him get off without saying anything. So I think the main thing they could have done was waited. And instead, what they did was go forward on theories based on not just a circumstantial case, but one that had a lot of holes in it, and actively suppressed the evidence that would have pointed to other theories. And I think that's what got them in trouble now. I just think there was a lot of pressure on them, and they sort of, went full force without getting all their ducks in a row and without disclosing evidence. And that's what led to this pretty extraordinary suppression. I could even imagine a dismissal at that point, just because so much critical evidence was suppressed, and it was very exculpatory, and that's a huge violation of constitutional rights. So yeah, I just think they really jumped the gun.
And we're going to have Dr. G explain these next two comments here. This one from Sonny, new here, but Suzanne is on my mind 24/7. She deserves justice. Welcome, by the way, Sonny. And I love the name Sonny. I'm an abuse survivor. I was Suzanne, but I got out in time. My daughters are just realizing who their father is. Give the daughters time. She's saying that because the daughters are standing by Barry's side. Are you surprised by that right now? And the question implies that we would think he is guilty. But what about the fact that both these daughters, who are young adults, are backing, one might be a teenager, but are backing the dad?
That doesn't surprise me at all. And what an awful situation this is for them. They presumably have lost their mother. To their father was taken away in the sense that he was preparing to go on trial. Obviously, he didn't. So I'm not even sure that they would allow themselves to consider. I mean, obviously, I've never talked to them. I don't know how they feel about this, but I'm not sure that they would even allow themselves to consider. Most people probably wouldn't in this kind of situation, even if there had been some domestic violence history with the mother, whether they knew about that or not, and whether that happened or not, we don't know. But it doesn't surprise me at all. Actually, that's exactly what I would expect.
Yeah. And we've seen now. We saw that with Chad Daybell, the Lori Vallow case, that the children are standing by Chad, even though he's facing the death penalty potentially. Lorna McKenzie here says, Dr. G, I think that's the reason Suzanne had the affair, because she was so unhappy with Barry controlling her. He was reported to be a very controlling person. Is that a reason why people will oftentimes, cheat on their spouses? I mean, he's a good-looking guy. He was an athlete. I think he was a pro athlete for a short time. Went for a guy that you might not expect her to go for, but is that uncommon?
Not at all. The one thing that we see when people are in relationships, particularly ones with someone who is controlling, is that there are different things that people do to try to feel more in control. And sometimes it's affairs. Sometimes it has to do with how they choose to eat. There's all sorts of ways that we do it, but that's not an unusual way at all if that's in fact true. So
shout out to Maui Swift, who's been a big supporter of the show from almost day one. And I feel like I overlook her. And shout out to Baby Doll as well, saying hello to Johnny Grusing. Jeremy, back to you. So there are all these things that we've talked about a little bit, these strange alibis and cues. One of them is the chipmunk alibi. So they did some forensic work on the cell phones, and the cell phone was buzzing around the house. When questioned about it, he said he was chasing chipmunks. And then they find a tranquilizer, a plastic cap for a syringe that the state believes was used to load a tranquilizer dart into the couple's dryer, which is why Aya said there might not have been any blood found. Of these two things, I don't know. The chipmunk thing made me kind of roll my eyes and say, this guy is, creating stories. But what do you make of it?
I mean, the chipmunk thing sounds dumb.
Yeah.
But so does the fact that they're using ping data inside of a house.
Yeah.
Right? Like ping data is your cell phone pings off of a cell phone tower, and it's almost the prosecution was using junk science.
Mm-hmm.
Ping data is not necessarily junk science, but it's not going to necessarily pin somebody going through their house like that. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Like ping data is for, you can put somebody at a location, not necessarily an exact location, but a location within a place where there could be, a cell phone tower and things like that. So it's incredibly unreliable. Probably also very unreliable that, Barry Morphew is running or is going through his house shooting chipmunks, right? I mean, that's also stupid. But with that being said, it's just so nonsensical, both of them. Yeah. And so it's really hard to counter the two different theories. The tranquilizer, that's interesting. There are a lot of reasons why an avid outdoorsman may have a tranquilizer, but it's far more likely that they have a shotgun shell or some kind of bullet than a tranquilizer, So I think that is something really interesting. But on the flip side of that, if Barry Morphew is really as calculated as we suspect him to be, or law enforcement really suspects him to be, and the district attorney's office suspects him to be, is he going to have just a tranquilizer cartridge that is something that was used in Suzanne's disappearance and potential death, so easily accessible and findable to law enforcement? That just doesn't make sense either. I mean, if he did it, right, in the words of OJ, if he did it, he knew what he was doing, and he's not going to leave things like the tranquilizer cartridge or packaging in his pocket, right? That just doesn't make sense either. And because he really did think about everything if he was the person that did it.
Yeah. So with his tranquilizer casing, for those who are not familiar, it was found in the couple's dryer. But Aya, there was no DNA on it that linked back to Barry or anyone else for that matter. What about the fact that there's, some, I guess, circumstantial evidence, but no direct evidence really at all in this case that we're seeing? How problematic is that?
It's a hard case. I mean, there's so many twists and turns to this case. I think it makes total sense to me that the police would focus on Barry Morphew, and especially after hearing from Suzanne's friends that she was leaving him, that they had all this trouble, that they were in a really fraught relationship. And then even when they found out about the affair, that's consistent with their theory that he's angry over the affair. So he killed him. And statistically, right, when you have homicides, looking at domestic relations makes sense. That being said, every single piece of the circumstantial evidence has two sides to the story, part of it that makes it not even a very tight circumstantial case. So again, fingerprint, DNA, that kind of stuff that everyone's looking for with airtight circumstantial evidence, it doesn't implicate Barry, and in fact, it may implicate other people. If you take something like, the chipmunk theory, again, it's based on this ping evidence that's no good. And, I kind of agree with Dr. G. I've watched all of Barry's interviews and read their transcript. He is the type of guy who just spouts things out. Well, if it's this, it's that. If it's this, it's that. And what he said was, I sometimes hunt chipmunks. And he also did have a tranquilizer gun that he would use, and people attested to this in illegal like deer hunting sometimes. The thing about the tranquilizer gun is when the police found it like back in a shed somewhere, it was broken. That cap that was found in the dryer was like a hypodermic needle cap that was excluded with his DNA. It had some police DNA and some of the daughter's DNA. And like, we don't know what it could be. And it was also found 8 days after a very exhaustive physical evidence search of the house. So again, so I'm not saying like, okay, this proves he's innocent. It's that every, with a circumstantial case like this, there are all these links that have to add up to guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And each of these links, none of them are the one you go, well, that's it, right? Like they're all like these little links that have some issues with them.
Dr. G, both Jeremy and I have talked about, tunnel vision. That's the word that a lot of people use. Have we become conditioned as a society to immediately believe it is the husband? A lot of what he says makes you scratch your head. And does that include investigators, do you think? I just had Phil Waters on for Surviving My Biggest Case, which is going to come out in a week or two. He investigated over 400 homicides, and he's one of the best of the best. And he says he always lets the scene tell the story. He lets the evidence speak to him. But do you think now, number one, in the court of public opinion, are people leaning towards the husband always? And are investigators maybe slipping into that slippery slope?
That's a great question. I think, I think that it's hard to say, because with cases like this, when you see, like I said, when you look at the body cam footage, when you look at some of the early stuff, like I said, his behavior is a little odd. So I really think people base it more on what they're seeing. Like when you see him talk, even now, I don't think people connect with him very well when they watch him talk about this. And I think that's a big problem for him. So I think that the way he speaks, the way he presents, has more to do with why people suspect him rather than just him being the husband. As far as investigators go, I think that they probably do make some mental shortcuts if that's what they see more often. I guess it doesn't happen that often in small towns or in these counties, but I do think it makes a certain amount of sense, particularly given the context that that's where they would take things. But I don't know if there is an implicit bias, so to speak, for the husband. I think that there probably is always the need to eliminate that, but I don't think people are going to go ahead and presume they actually did it unless there's something that makes them scratch their head about it.
Yeah.
I always find that no matter how the husband reacts, it's all, if he cries too much, he's too emotional. If he doesn't cry at all, he must have done it because he wasn't emotional enough. It's
a lose-lose for the husband.
It's tough, and that's one of the tough things about seeing people in distress is what's the right way to act, right? Like we know, I don't think there's a right way to act, but sometimes we'll look at something and go, that feels like the wrong way to act. I think, and that's what we tend to react to. That doesn't always mean that necessarily we're right about it, but you look at somebody like Alec Murdaugh, when the way that he behaved, and I don't know how much you guys are familiar with his case, but the way he behaved when he was being questioned by police seemed way over the top and sort of weird. But I do think that we can, whether we're trained to or not, we can get a feeling for whether or not if something doesn't seem consistent. We just sort of have a gut reaction to that. That doesn't necessarily, like I said, doesn't mean somebody's guilty, but it means that there's something that we're not making sense of, and we can pick up on that pretty quickly. So
from G&P here, the job site Barry was going to did not allow permits for work on any weekends or holidays. Do you know that to be true? I had not heard that.
I don't know that to be true or not. That's not a piece of evidence I've heard, but I could imagine that could be the case.
STS Nation is usually on the ball. Chitty Chatty Meg, I like that name. He chased her down and shot her with a tranquilizer gun. He's an animal that might walk. Again, that is the perception or the belief that a lot of people do have. Back to this spy pen, and people who have not heard about this case are probably going, what the hell are they talking about? But so a spy pen basically right out of a James Bond movie. It was able to capture and record conversations, and it happened to capture and record a conversation between Suzanne Morphew and a man she was having an affair with, I believe from Michigan. He was a married guy with 6 kids. My first question is, do we know why there was a spy pen in the house to begin with? Who did it belong to and why?
Yeah, we do. And I want to say one thing about just the comment. I think that one of the things that really did color the perception in this case is almost immediately after that police affidavit came out, the newspaper ran a headline, Barry Morphew hunted Suzanne Morphew with a tranquilizer gun like an animal, right? Like, and so that I think is a very, that's going to be the type of headline that colors a perception, because not only is it, sort of this horrific murder, but also like, my God, if he's hunted her like a chipmunk, that's like another level of horror. Okay, so the spy pen. The spy pen, in this very sort of odd twist, Suzanne was having this wild and passionate and pretty amazing affair with Jeff Libler, where they would meet all over the world. And, he has 6 kids, and he's kind of telling her he's going to run away to Ecuador to marry her, but telling his wife with the 6 kids, no, honey, everything's fine, right? But at the same time where she's having this affair, she was incredibly worried, it seems, according to her friends, or convinced that Barry was having an affair. So a friend of hers, I think it was both sort of this worry that Barry was having an affair, or also just maybe wanting to catch, Barry saying some things, but to aid in her leaving Barry. The friend gives her this spy pen that looks like a normal pen, but it's really recording everything. And then it has a little USB, and you plug it in and you can get the recordings. And during the search of the house after her disappearance, they find this spy pen. And a lot of the recordings are deleted, but what they found is, even though the spy pen, she had put in Barry's car, and one of the things that came to light in the affidavit was he was listening to true crime podcasts, and therefore he was probably like planning a murder. But amongst the things that caught, that was one of them. But it also caught a lot of conversations that she was having with a man named Jeff. So it was this spy pen that revealed to the police 6 months after their investigation had commenced that there was this other man out there named Jeff.
And as I had just mentioned, it took investigators 6 months to identify this guy, Jeff. He did have a wife and 6 children. No idea if he's still married or not. And he never came forward on his own, which is understandable because he got caught in a trap, a married guy with 6 kids. But he did cooperate once, investigators did come knocking on his door. He gave up his DNA, his phone records. And I believe he was cleared. They were able to verify an alibi. This comment, Dr. G, made me think of you right away from Yin Yang. Money will bring Barry down in the end. Assuming for a moment that he is guilty, just making the hypothetical assumption.
Sure.
What kind of hubris would it be for him to now be suing all these, state entities here?
I mean, that wouldn't surprise me. I don't think that him suing them implies innocence by any stretch. So if someone was guilty of this crime, it wouldn't surprise me that they would follow up to show that you'd have to be pretty grandiose to commit this kind of crime in the first place. So it wouldn't surprise me at all to go and try to sue a lot of people following that. That doesn't, once again, I don't think that implies his guilt or innocence, the fact that he's doing that, but it wouldn't surprise me that someone that is guilty would follow up and try to do something like this.
I just want to add that I don't know how he's going to get around governmental immunity. And so, and I have, I mean,
yeah, he sued immediately after Colorado passed a state, law that got rid of qualified immunity on state constitutional claims. So I think they're hoping for that. They have filed the federal, which, I mean, I guess they're just going to argue that it was clearly established unconstitutional, but they did it like right after that law went into effect.
I still think there's a qualified immunity for like the prosecutors and things like, I mean, they've sued essentially everybody. And when they talk about money bringing Barry down, if they go and get summary judgments against Barry Morphew for bringing essentially claims that he could not have brought, they can have their attorney's fees awarded against Morphew, and their costs. So I think Mr. Morphew, on not just a criminal side, but from a personal and financial side, is making a very, very huge mistake. You know, sometimes it's better to ride off into the sunset with your victory, right? If he did it or if he didn't do it, he was cleared of, essentially not cleared, but he's not being prosecuted for murder charges. The reason why we're essentially talking about this case again is potentially because of this lawsuit, because the case closed almost a year ago or more than a year ago. But now we have the lawsuit. Now we have, as a result of the lawsuit, the prosecutor saying that the bodies, we're going to find the body. We don't want to dismiss with prejudice. You know, I think the listener who said money will bring him down, that very well may be true, because we're talking about it again now when the case hasn't been talked about for months.
Very interesting point, Dr. G.
So something I want you to keep in mind also is that, and once again, I don't know if he's actually controlling or not. Let's just assume that he is a controlling guy. You're going to make decisions against your best interest to feel in control. And that's one of the problems a lot of criminals struggle with. This is they need that control. They commit acts like murder because they want control over that person because they're going to leave or whatever it is. So, you know, if he in fact was guilty of this and then followed it up by doing something against his best interest, it wouldn't be entirely shocking, because that is definitely a move to regain control for sure. So,
you know, we're smart people. We can look at any of these moves as consistent with guilt and consistent with innocent based on the story you tell, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I always say whatever a lawyer says, I tend to believe. I don't know why, because it should be the exact opposite, but you guys are generally good at persuading people. Kara Cow Young says the DNA were only partial matches, did not meet standards. That is correct, Aya?
So partial match isn't, you know, I'm not a DNA expert. I'm obviously not a DNA scientist, but the whole idea of like a partial DNA profile, I think that's what maybe they mean. They were only partial DNA profiles. And, you know, there is a certain level at which when you put the profile into Codex, it has to meet before it says it's a hit, it's a positive hit, and it met it. You know, I mean, could some DNA expert come in and say like, well, you know, there's a question of whether that hit, how accurate it is. Yes, but again, you know, the prosecution is then in the position of proving that the Codex hit is not a good hit, right? They're usually in the position of saying, okay, the Codex hit on this defendant, it's a good hit. So it's true. I don't think that piece of DNA evidence, and what I'm talking about is they found DNA evidence in the glove compartment of Suzanne's car. And that's what hit to these open sex offense cases. And then they called up the Arizona police, and it turns out they had actually arrested somebody.
Is this guy, sorry to interrupt, but is this guy in custody right now? Is he serving time for this?
You know, I haven't followed it up since we did the 48 Hours episode, but the last I had heard was they had the police, the Salida police, or maybe it was the Colorado Bureau of Investigations. One of the detectives had followed it up to a name, right? And they had contacted or attempted to contact that person, and that person had responded that he had a lawyer and you couldn't contact him. And that's the last I heard about an actual person being linked to those cold sexual assault cases that match that hit. But again, you know, none of this proves that Barry didn't do it. It just, you know, there was a DNA of somebody else who matched in the, you know, a partial profile, yes, that matched in codex to this, you know, these various sexual assault cases. That's a wild piece of evidence just to keep under wraps. You know, there was also unidentified male DNA all over the bike and helmet, right? Like all over the scene that didn't match up to any of the people who they identified as being at the scene, the detectives and other people there. They had done elimination samples. So it's not to say that this couldn't all be true and Barry Morphew did it. It's just that, like, here are all these DNA pieces of evidence pointing to other people. And yeah, you could say they're not perfect, but they're definitely something.
A little while ago, Jeremy mentioned O.J. Simpson. This comment reminds me exactly that. Dr. G, it's for you from Manushka. Barry's not trying to find his wife or anyone else who could have done anything. O.J. really wasn't looking too hard afterwards either. He's not seeking justice for his wife. To be fair, we don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but I guess the overall impression is that he's not working too hard to try to locate her. Is that just the product of a bad marriage, or is that a person who may know why he does not need to look for her?
It's a good question. I think it's a fair question when somebody asks, well, why at least does he not appear to be working harder? We don't, you know, like you said, we don't really know what he is and isn't doing. But if, for argument's sake, he isn't doing a lot of legwork to try to find her, yeah, that doesn't necessarily mean that he killed her. It might just mean that he, you know, is not incredibly motivated to find her. That's possible too.
He was also sitting in custody for a long time.
Yeah,
I mean, he did put out $100,000 reward and went on YouTube and did the whole rounds in the beginning, which, of course, again, if you believe he's innocent, well, it's because he's innocent. If you believe he's guilty, it's because he's guilty.
Yeah, it is very. My wife and I always joke about this, but there is no way for a husband to win. Jeremy, you were going to say something. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I just think that, like, he was sitting in custody and then he was charged. Like, if I were, and he's the most hated man in a small mountain town, right? Like, we're not talking about getting lost in Manhattan here. Like, this is a town of maybe 10,000 people in the peak season of summer and the peak season of winter. I mean, it's not like he can go. I mean, he was really a man that, even when he was out of jail, was essentially kind of trapped in his own kind of world, because it's just a really bad situation.
Yeah, all around. This is interesting too from LS. Barry Morphew has a hunter mindset. He's an avid hunter. Dr. G, does that change? You know, if you're the hunters I know, a lot of them are alpha males, and I don't want to stereotype, but that's just the case. Is there something to be said about the psychological makeup, to use that word with you, about being a hunter that could propel you to potentially commit a heinous crime, or does it have nothing to do? There are a lot of hunters that don't.
I would find that very unlikely that those are related, honestly. So probably not.
All right, glad you cleared that up. What about this, Jeremy? Back to you. At the time, it seems like the state prosecutors were rather intimidated by Barry's very expensive, high-powered lawyers. Your thoughts, Jeremy?
You know, I talked about this a little bit before. The prosecutor, the state's attorney, was Linda Stanley, right? So Linda Stanley, I've known her. She was a Pueblo County prosecutor, and then was kind of, something happened. She was no longer there. Then she went as a Pueblo City attorney, where she was prosecuting very low-level traffic offenses. At some point, she went to be a DMV administrative judge, which essentially she's hearing license revocations for some people that have too many points. And then she opened up her own practice, where she was reprimanded by the Supreme Court. And then this opportunity came to run as a Republican in a very conservative district against an incumbent Democrat. And she won the election, not by a huge number, you know. And I think in a jurisdiction where President Trump got, I think, somewhere close to 70% of the vote, she got 55%. So it was not a huge number, but she is just outmatched. And where things really went down is she had brought on a prosecutor by the name of Jeff Lindsay. Jeff Lindsay is a prosecutor who's been in Colorado Springs, which is a much larger metropolitan area, and then he'd gone down to Pueblo when we had a regime change at the prosecutor's office in Colorado Springs. And Jeff was really somebody who could handle this case. Jeff is a very experienced prosecutor. I've gone up against Jeff Lindsay on some high-profile cases. He knows what he's doing. He's good. He left that office, I think, when he realized how inept Linda Stanley was, and he wanted nothing to do with it. And then she was really flying, with a very low budget, a very difficult time finding prosecutors to even prosecute the case. And then we have Ira C, who is one of the top attorneys in the state of Colorado, defending some of the highest profile cases. I think her firm many years ago was the same firm that defended Kobe Bryant when he was charged out in Colorado with the crime. Was the same firm, I think it's Haddon Morgan, who's the woman who was prosecuted in New York, Jeffrey Epstein.
Ghislaine Maxwell.
Ghislaine Maxwell, same firm that Ghislaine Maxwell hired, and Jeff Pagliuca was flying to New York and defending her. So this is a firm who knows what they're doing. They're very good defense attorneys. They have the resources. If you can afford to hire the firm, you can afford to put on a good defense. And so, I know I'm being long-winded here, but there are so many. It's chess versus checkers. I can't say that enough. Like, they're just smarter. There's good surgeons and there's bad surgeons. There's good lawyers and there's bad lawyers. And this is one of the best lawyers that money can buy against somebody who was hearing, speeding tickets for the state.
And Barry's got he has the resources. His business was doing well, according to all accounts. Aya, to you, and then we'll get to this comment for Dr. G. So on May 9th, which was the day before Mother's Day, phone records show that Suzanne Morphew and the man she was having an affair with, that they messaged each other 59 times. She took what investigators called a last proof of life selfie. Barry that day was out running errands, and he sent her a text basically saying, "Did you leave?" He's met with silence from her. Then the question kind of arises, did Barry even know about this affair? And my bigger question to you is, how does this affair complicate his defense? And does it help the state?
Honestly, I don't think he knew about the affair. It's just not. I think we would have more explosive evidence between them and the children and people. And again, from the time they found that a Jeff existed, it took the FBI 6 months to figure out that it was Jeff Libler. It was a very well hidden affair. Now, that being said, there is some evidence that, they were accusing each other of cheating, that it was, if you want to use the affair to show that he had some jealousy and they didn't have a good relationship, I think that there is evidence of that there was jealousy on both sides. They didn't have a good relationship. I don't necessarily think he knew about Libler. What I find really interesting about that whole series of events, because May 9th is the day before she officially goes missing, but that's the day she's theorized to have been murdered. And the theory is that, she was essentially sexting her lover, right? There's pretty clear evidence that they went on WhatsApp and engaged in intimate acts. So the theory is that Barry came home and maybe even caught them in this act, and then in a fit of rage chased around, killed her. Although I don't know how consistent that is with the like perfectly planned out murder, but right, that's one of the theories going around. It's really interesting though that there's some physical evidence that complicates the matter. One is after the time of the quote unquote proof of life and him saying, "Oh, I'm coming home," Barry saying, "I'm coming home." Jeff actually did text or WhatsApp or one of those apps to Suzanne and say, you know, basically my crew is home, his family, so we have to stop communications. And then there's also some evidence that her phone was being used and the computer was being used later in the night. So there's interesting evidence here. And here's the point I want to make. It's hard for me to believe that Jeff Libler has nothing to add about what happened between about 2:30 on May 9th and the rest of the day. And I just wonder, like, has that been asked? What did he say?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And we don't
There's
know.
Also, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Something else that Aya said that's important is we talk about the evidence there is, but we also don't talk about the evidence there's not, right? There's no blood spatter like in the house. If he's running around, there's no GSR that they found. And I mean, if you shoot a gun in a house or anything like that, there's going to be evidence of that all over the place. Like gunshot.
However, there is, which I was getting to next, but since you brought it up, there are signs of a possible struggle. There were scratch marks found on Barry. He was asked about it. And then the door in the master bedroom had a vertical crack along the door frame, and Barry's response to that is, "I have no idea what the crack is from." If you're presuming that maybe a tranquilizer dart was used, Jeremy, then there wouldn't be blood splatter, but there could be scratches on Barry, which there were. So I don't know. It's complicated, right? I mean, how do you?
I mean, you guys do true crime. There have been cases where the crime scene, like they don't find a lot of physical evidence, and then the person ends up confessing or some video turns up. So it's not impossible, right? Like to have a fairly pristine crime scene and a murder occurred there. It's just, again, it's less likely.
Yeah. So we talked about this already, and then we'll move forward. Just so there was DNA on the glove box of Suzanne's Range Rover. Everyone's yelling at me to say that they were partial profiles, so I will reiterate that. And then there was some forensic evidence from Barry's truck. He said that he went to bed around 8 p.m. This is the day that the murder is presumed to have happened, the day before Mother's Day on May 9th, which is, by the way, my dog Ethel Bug Johnson's birthday. But anyway, I digress for a moment. But his truck's computer shows the truck was put in reverse and backed up towards the house around 9:30 p.m. So he said he went to bed, but digital forensic shows 9:30 p.m. is when he backed the truck up. Jeremy, how problematic is that for the defense?
It's obviously not a great fact if you're putting the truck in reverse and potentially throwing a body in the back of it right after something happens. But again, obviously as a defense attorney, you want somebody to keep their mouth shut, say nothing. And so when, you hear this down the road, the truck was in reverse, there's some kind of logical explanation as opposed to, I don't know, I was sleeping. I don't know how my truck magically went into reverse. With that being said, these are just small little inconsistencies. The truth is, if we had a better prosecutor, if we had better lawyers, maybe it adds up to enough to make a conviction and bring Suzanne Morphew's killer to justice, right? But we don't have that. And so it's really, I would hate that fact. I would hate the fact that somebody said they went to bed and they were sleeping, and all of a sudden we have, evidence that the truck was going in reverse. Yeah. But the problem is that putting a case together is like putting a puzzle together. You can put together enough pieces to get the picture, and that's great. But if you don't have people that are smart enough to put the pieces together, then you're not going to get a conviction. I have a feeling that if we had your listeners prosecuting this case, we would have had a conviction. But that's not what we have here.
Yeah, STS Nation, they will convict. These guys know the law too, and most of them are not attorneys, as far as I know. Dr. G, and we'll start to wrap up in a moment. What do you think about Barry's 28-second video for Suzanne's return? This is what I was talking about a little while ago. You can Google this and see it. And he says, "Oh, Suzanne, whoever has you." He didn't seem overly emphatic. Let's put it that way. How do you read into it?
It's so as someone myself who has ADHD, it's a near constant struggle not to say something stupid constantly. So when I see something like this, I'm like, is he impulsive and just doesn't think through what he's going to say? I mean, I do wonder, because, I didn't necessarily read that as a sign of guilt, but just as a sign of someone who talks off the cuff too much. And maybe that's exactly what he wanted to say, or somebody who has big ideas that just don't pan out that well. So I thought it was strange, but I didn't necessarily think that implicated his guilt.
And Dr. G, right back to you with Ashley. I thought Barry seemed very odd on the body cam. He never asked law enforcement any questions, just started railing off reasons not to look at him. You talked about that a little bit. Care to expound on it a tiny bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, he just, describing him as very odd, I think is fair, because presumably if his wife's bike had been found and her body was not there, something problematic likely happened, and he just didn't seem very connected to that fact. Was he in denial that something was going on? I guess that's also possible, but it was not very consistent with how many of us presume we would feel if someone that we loved and cared about was missing or potentially hurt or something like that. So
this comment from Baby Doll, I never heard this. If this is true, this is funny. Barry is so delusional that when they arrested him, he told Grusing, "I thought we were friends." No idea if she's being sarcastic. I think she is.
No, I believe that. I think I remember that.
Really?
But what we have to also keep in mind is that the detectives went over and he made dinner for them because they were going over to pray with him. And when they prayed with him, they also were recording everything, right? Like, so they, maybe, yes, it could be delusion. Like, he couldn't imagine that they would suspect him. But it was also that was part of a policing tactic, for better or ill, was, to act like his friend. It's the Mutt and Jeff, right? The Mutt part, or the Jeff part. I don't know.
Can I say one thing about Special Agent Grusing? Because I've watched his interrogation of Letitia Stout, and he is really awesome for anybody who has never watched him work. Like
he's fantastic.
He really is, yeah. So yeah. I could see people feeling connected to him that have met him, because he just has an energy about him.
He's so measured and smart and just very calm under pressure.
Yeah.
And
did you guys cover the Stout case?
We did not on our show.
Wow.
I was yelled at plenty for that, but yeah, we need to. Probably a little too late for that now. No, but we should, and we will maybe in the future. A couple real quick things here. So, Aya, back to you. Multiple trash runs. Barry's seen jumping around from dumpster to dumpster to dumpster. Another bad fact. He says that he wanted to avoid paying landfill fees. Problematic again. I mean,
there's just so much. Like, I think one of your listeners said he's creepy. There's just so much that's creepy, right? Like the whole chipmunks thing, and the tranquilizing deers and the bucks and the elks, and then the trash runs and everything. He's creepy, right? And the fact that he left early in the morning, and then there's even camera footage of him like stopping in like a parking lot across from a fast food restaurant and going into their dumpster, and it looks guilty as sin, right? I mean, like when you paint that picture, it's like it looks guilty as sin. Again, however, there are always little things, like they did search all the trash dumpsters and it was trash. They did, check the bed of his truck, swabbed it for blood, DNA, nothing, right? Like, so you have a bunch of really creepy looking, really suspicious looking things. Do they add up to guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? Or is it just sort of a confluence of creepy guy, but didn't kill his wife, right?
Yeah, and it's a very fine line, I guess, amongst many men. Creepy or killer, I don't know. We'll find out in due time. For those who do not know, and he's certainly not creepy, this guy's smart. Jeremy Lowe, is a pleasure to have him on the show. He is a former Colorado State public defender turned Colorado Springs criminal defense attorney. And prior to his legal practice, as we heard, he worked in politics, not for one, but for two United States presidents. There are allegations by the state, I guess, or evidence that they suggest points to the fact that the scene was staged. Jeremy, what do you make of that, if anything, and your final thoughts?
You know, I think that anything is obviously possible. I think that it's not like you can mail order sex offender DNA, right? That there's no website for that.
There might be.
I mean, at least I would hope
I
not.
hope not.
It might be in Korea.
Right. Or, you know, the bike perfectly placed, and the you would want to think that, you know, even as a defense attorney, I try and think the best of people, and to perfectly stage something, it just seems really, really, really hard to fathom. But I guess, as we've discussed earlier, anything's really possible. People are out of their minds and just getting crazier every day. So maybe somebody's calculated enough to order, you know, sex offender DNA, or talk to somebody and plan their spouse's murder in such a calculated way. But then on the flip side, are they really going to make so many stupid mistakes like Barry Morphew did by going to the trash with a bunch of different bags, not knowing about the vehicle data, you know, not remembering that he backed up there's too many things that are mistakes that make it so if he was that calculated to set up the perfect crime scene, that he would have done better on little other aspects too.
Dr. G, I think I asked you this last time and Jeremy just brought it up. Is the world getting crazier? Are people getting stranger, or is it just our perception, and has it always been a weird place?
I think the world's always been a violent and dangerous place. I think the way we behave maybe is a little overtly stranger than it used to be, but otherwise I think that, you know, and people are getting a little bit more isolated. So there are aspects of the world that are getting a little weirder, but I don't think that the crimes are changing a whole lot. Maybe just the package they come in.
And there was some troubling text between Suzanne and her friend. She wrote to her friend, "I feel no peace when he's here. I would not feel safe alone with him. He won't speak of divorce. I'm done. I could care less what you're up to and have been for years." She texted to Barry, "We just need to figure this out civilly." For those who do not know, Dr. G, JP Garrison, is an all-around great guy. Now a friend of the show. Love when he's on here. He has his YouTube channel, Dr. G Explains. What is Dr. G's option on the suspect's personality? Do you have a personality profile for whoever did this?
It's tough, you know. So much of the information we know about his personality or claims are like with the text that we're finding now and things that we're hearing. So much of it is through like people texting each other, and so much awful things are said to each other through text, and so many it's so hard to glean whether or not you can gauge a whole lot about his personality based on those things. So it's hard to say, right? If he's a controlling guy, then that's obviously very concerning. If he has been abusive, if that's in fact true, that also lends credence to a very concerning personality profile. But I think there's still so much that is unconfirmed at this point, at least to the best of my knowledge, and that makes it a little hard.
No one's got a better voice than Dr. G. Wendy B became a YouTube member. Thank you, Wendy B. Big shout out.
Does anybody think we find the body?
We're about to get there. I don't know. For full disclosure, I just don't know enough about the case. I mean, it sounds like it's in a remote area, but I interviewed Johnny Grusing about the Scott Kimball serial killer, which happened in Colorado, and they found bodies in the most remote places imaginable in Utah and Colorado. So it is possible. I don't know. But I mean, to Jeremy's point, Aya, and Ann Vroom's comment here, if the state does discover Suzanne's body, is it game back on vis-a-vis Barry, as she is suggesting?
You know, I think it depends. I kind of hope they find a body and hope that the body's in a condition to give us some answers. you know, because it would be nice for there to be closure and justice, and not the risk that, you know, it's not him and he's getting convicted, or that he did it and he's going away in jail. But I just don't know, A, if they're going to find the body, or B, if it's going to give us any answers, given that the condition it might be in. Hey, am I allowed to use my little bit of time to ask Dr. G a question?
100%.
Okay, because a lot of people ask me, since I've read all the documents, like, do I think he did it? And, you know, at first I was like a statistical thinker, like it's usually the husband, and especially if it's fraud. So he probably did it, and the crime scene was cleaned well, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But then when his daughters sort of, you know, were standing by him, I thought to myself, well, the daughters were insistent there was never any history of abuse, blah, blah, blah. So maybe, you know, maybe it was somebody, you know, a sex offender, or a group of people who nabbed her and maybe raped her in the woods, and they ditched her body, right? But then there was something really interesting that just in rereading the documents I saw. And when she writes him that, you know, I'm seriously done, you know, no more of this, I want a divorce. You know, of course he doesn't say, well, I'm going to kill you. Like that would be, you know, super.
Right.
But what he does say is something along the lines of, you know, I'm going to be with the Lord soon. I'm going to kill myself. Right? Like when that happens, I'm going to kill myself. And to me, like, especially like men with guns, with accidents of guns, that whole suicide, you know, and in love when they're emotionally overwrought, the suicide homicide thing isn't that far apart. And I had missed that. I had missed the suicidal ideation. And am I making a bigger deal of that than it is?
No, and I won't, just because I haven't seen that myself. But what I can say with couples that I work with where this is thrown around, because this is not uncommon for people to go like, fine, if you're going to leave or whatever, like I just might as well kill myself. Or when people get drunk, they say these kinds of things. Oftentimes that would implicate a controlling personality, that they feel out of control and they go, fine, well, I've got, you know, that's sort of a trump card right now, which is that fine, if you're going to leave, then I'll, you know, kill myself. How do you feel about that? So it's not unusual to see people that are controlling to use that kind of language.
By the way, they talked about Suzanne and her, the man she's having an affair with, talked about running away to Ecuador in this comment. Could she be in Ecuador? I'm no psychologist and I'm no lawyer, but my answer to that is no way, because she wouldn't leave her daughters.
Yeah.
For those who do not know, Ira Gruber, she's an expert on criminal law and procedure, violence against women, and critical theory. Before joining the USC Gould School of Law, she taught at the University of Colorado, which is how she's sort of connected to this case. She was just featured on 48 Hours about the Suzanne Morphew case. Aya, while I have you, STS Nation, we are drumming up noise about a case out of Philly, which I would love for you to look at. Ellen Greenberg, if you haven't heard about it, we did it this week, and I could send you a link. She was found dead back in 2011. She was stabbed 20 times, 10 to the front, 10 to the back of her head and the back of her neck. She was engaged at the time. A independent autopsy found that 2 of the stab wounds came after she had died, and it was ruled a homicide, quickly changed to undetermined, and then switched to a suicide. The fiance's family is very high up in the Philadelphia sort of world of celebrity, and high up in the legal profession in that city. And I'd love for you to take a look at it. Josh and Sandy Greenberg have been on the show. We're going to do another show about this next week, but I'd love to get legal minds like yourself and Jeremy looking at that case to try to help get her some justice. So please do look at that if you can. Quick programming note. Tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern time, Great Scott, it's your True Crime Phil with former FBI agent Scott Duffy. And then listen to this, everyone. Sunday, Call It a Comeback. She's coming back, and we're doing a noon live to accommodate Carm, who is in the Holy Land, hanging out there for the summer. But she's going to come on, and we are doing the show about another story that I know Aya would be interested in now that she's at USC. There's a guy named Brett Cantor. Google him. He was a rising music executive. He was murdered back in 1993 at the age of 25. He was stabbed something like 22 times. The case is still open, and we have the lead investigator from the LAPD coming on to discuss that case Sunday at noon. A cold case that they're hoping to warm up. Until then, love you, America. Love you, Georgia. Of course, we love you, Colorado. Everyone stand by for 1 second.